Learn how to effectively share your faith with Bill Newman's Academy of Evangelism. Equip yourself to share your faith in Christ with Bill Newman's Academy of Evangelism. Media and evangelism, live streaming and podcasts. Presented by Carl Fays.
Hi, welcome to this video looking at gospel ministry through media, or using media and different forms of media in gospel ministry. So I want to start with a biblical perspective. If you've watched a few of these videos, you will probably, almost everyone will start with the Great Commission. But I want to say the first thing about gospel ministry through media is we need to be committed. Jesus, we put out a series called Jesus the Game Changer. And in season 2, the theme of Jesus the Game Changer, season 2, was making Jesus' last words our first priority. And essentially, Jesus' last words in most of the Gospels is about the Great Commission, being sent, going into the world. You know, in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me," that's himself. And then he says, "Therefore, because of that, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, and surely I'll be with you always to the end of the age." And you will know that the kind of imperative, the command in this, is not actually about the gospel, it's about going. And as you go, share the gospel. And in media ministry, in gospel ministry in the media, it's about being committed to the Great Commission. Not just about entertaining people, not just about being interesting, not just about being technologically savvy or culturally relevant. All those things are important. But first, what is most important is be committed to the Great Commission. Be committed to the gospel ministry Jesus sends us to. Not only be committed, but here's an odd one, be extravagant in sharing the gospel. Luke chapter 8, Jesus tells the parable of the sower. I love this parable for all sorts of reasons, especially the interaction between Jesus' disciples. He gives the parable about the sower who goes out to sow, spreads the seed extravagantly, which I'll come back to. Some fell on the path, some fell in the thorn, some fell on the rocky ground, and some fell on the very good ground. Then later on, they get into a personal, private conversation away from the crowd, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Great story, great parable. What does that mean?" And Jesus explains the parable. And I don't want to go into the depth of the parable other than saying this. When Jesus explains the parable of the sower that goes out to sow the seed, and it's clear in the parable that the seed is the word of God, the message of Jesus, the gospel that we want to share, there is no value judgment from Jesus on the sower's ability to hit good soil. Did you notice that? Jesus doesn't say to his disciples, "Now, a completely incompetent sower who couldn't hit the side of a barn from 10 feet with a handful of seed, spread seed across the field." Jesus, it's all about where the seed falls and what the response of that place is. The parable of the sower tells us about gospel ministry, and I think gospel ministry, especially in media, that be extravagant. Share as broadly and as spread it as widely as you possibly can. But the third thing, which is almost stands in opposition to that, be extravagant, but be wise. Now, we're going to come back to this a couple of times, but I'm referring to Paul in the Areopagus in Acts chapter 17. Over my time in ministry, it's a very well used, probably overused piece of scripture. But what happens when Paul goes to the Areopagus? It's the place of learning. It's where all those who didn't have to work and spend all day thinking about new ideas could gather together and listen to the latest new idea. Paul gets the opportunity to speak, and what does he say? Now, I want to come back to that later, but I want to say this here, that Paul is wise about what he says in the Areopagus. Up to that point in Acts, we never hear Paul sharing the message of Jesus in those terms, in that way, using those ideas, terminologies, way of interacting with his audience. Now, he's probably done it before, but Dr. Luke hadn't given us that information to any point up to Acts chapter 17. And here in this new place, what we see out of Paul, he's wise. He's thoughtful. He doesn't just tread the same paths he's been treading the whole way through the gospel. In media ministry, in using the media for gospel ministry, be committed to the gospel. Stick with the gospel. Be clear about the gospel. But be extravagant in spreading it, because media gives you an enormous field to spread the message of Jesus in. But be wise in how you do that. So one of the things about media ministry, it's a bit like people kind of talk about it as if it's a new time, it's a new thing. You know, this last 50, 100 years, there's all these new media outlets, and then certainly the last 10 years, social media and the incredible expanse of the internet and opportunity to touch basically billions of people across the world. There's this idea that we're in a new age, and we are, but helpful to remember that if you think about communicating the message of Jesus to broader groups of people in an ever-expanding footprint, that's always been the case for the church. And I just want to give a few examples just to show you that media ministry is not somehow some new, completely new way of sharing the gospel because of what media has done for us. I mean, you think about some of these examples. When Paul was his missionary journeys and Paul's first work as a missionary, as recorded in Acts, Paul travels across the known world at that time. And what the Roman Empire had done across that world is built Roman roads. These roads were cobbled roads. In fact, you can go to different places across the Near East, across the Roman Empire, across even England, and these roads still exist. I'm recording this just after we had biblical rains in Sydney, and our roads are completely potholed all the way across Sydney. And the crazy thing is, these roads have been down 10 years. Roman roads have been down 2,000 years, and they're still okay. These roads, why were these roads built by the Romans? So they could get their troops anywhere they could across their empire as quickly as they could. And yet, they were still used by other travellers. They were still used for business. They were still used for people walking around to visit their friends. And Paul, we believe, would have used them to spread the gospel. Those roads, rather than just the tracks that were available before, helped the spread of the gospel and helped what Paul was doing. Think about another road a number of years later called the Silk Road. We actually know from and some research we did for Jesus the Game Changer Season 2, the gospel was actually in central China probably about the 5th and 6th century, like not that long after Jesus. It spread, and what the Nestorians did, who were a group of Christians, the Nestorians actually followed the Silk Road. And the Silk Road went from the kind of Middle East and the Roman Empire area where Jesus and the gospel first started, and it actually travelled all the way along the Silk Road. Another opportunity to use a trade route for the kingdom of God. If you go jumping forward another 1,000 years, and this is talked about a lot, then it's a Gutenberg press. And the press changed the way we communicate, and the press changed the opportunity to spread a message across the world. It's been interesting to look at the Gutenberg press, because most people will say that if it hadn't been for the Gutenberg press, the Reformation and Martin Luther would probably have never got anywhere, because what happened with the Gutenberg press and that printing Martin Luther's words, what he wrote, etc., spread across the known world, across Europe very quickly. What's interesting to keep in mind is that the Reformation made the Gutenberg press as much as the Gutenberg press made the Reformation. In the years before 1517, and Gutenberg had invented the press in the middle of the 15th century, in the years before, there were, let me just read these to you, there were only 123 books published, an average an 8 a year in Latin and very small books. Just 123 in Latin, small books. Not a lot of distribution of those books. By the time from 1715 on over the next 30 years in Wittenberg alone, not all of Europe, just in Wittenberg alone, they published 2,721 books, an average of 91 books a year, and they represented about 3 million copies. So it was actually, in a way, the Reformation made the Gutenberg press as much as the Gutenberg press made the Reformation. The difference between Jan Hus, who lived 100 or so years before Martin Luther, who said many of the same things as Martin Luther and lost his life because of what he stood for, Reformation type ideas. One could suggest the difference between Jan Hus and Martin Luther was the Gutenberg press and printing. Now, there were other things about those who supported and protected Luther, but what we see is this enormous spread of the message of Jesus, the enormous spread of the ideas of the Reformation through the Gutenberg press. Go on a little bit further, and around that same time as the Gutenberg press, you actually have colonialism, ships and travel. The gospel spread across the globe through Portuguese and Spanish traders who not only went trading, there were, especially the Jesuits were on those ships, and they used something that we would see very negatively now, colonialism, as an opportunity for the gospel and an opportunity to spread the message of Jesus to the ends of the earth. We're making a new series at the moment, and one of the things that we're looking at is the gospel coming to Australia, and Richard Johnson and then Samuel Marsden coming to Australia on the First Fleet, and then Samuel Marsden a little bit later. What most people don't recognise is that Richard Johnson and Samuel Marsden later didn't just see themselves as chaplain serving convicts and the military in this far-flung colony, the penal colony. They actually came to Australia as they saw themselves as missionaries to the South Seas. That's why they saw themselves. And that's why Samuel Marsden is looked on very positively in New Zealand, because he took the message of Jesus to New Zealand and it spread across the islands. They saw themselves in the negative light of colonialism. They still saw themselves as bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. We can go through the television networks in America and Christian TV, which doesn't necessarily have a great reputation, but they use that to spread the message. Then go on a little bit further and we have the internet, this huge footprint across the globe of probably 5 million or so people these days. And I said billion across the globe, 90-something% of them accessing the net through their own personal smartphones. All of this is just another new opportunity. So all I'm saying in this whole process is, don't be thinking that somehow media and online media and social media, et cetera, is somehow something new that's never happened before in the church. There's always been new ways of sharing the gospel. There's always been new ways of taking the message to the end of the earth. And what the church has always done, whether it's Paul walking down a Roman road, whether it was a Jesuit priest getting on a ship, Portuguese trading ship to go to Japan to take the message of Jesus, all of those people were using the opportunities that the latest technology gave them to share Jesus. And what we're doing with media is just following that train. Now, if you think about the size of media, if you think about the footprint of media, if you think about the number of people that are influenced by media, you'd probably end up saying, well, we should stop everything else. Media is the best way of reaching people. You can get to basically hundreds of thousands, millions, if not billions of people using media and using the web across the globe. Why would we bother with any other mission and evangelism and ministry when if we just put all our eggs in that basket, because that's the best way to reach a lot of people? Well, before you rush down that track, and by the way, I'm sure you're not, but before we rush down that track, I want to quote a guy called Andy Crouch, who worked for Christianity Today magazine as an editor, and he's somewhat of an expert in the area of media and in communication through media. And Andy Crouch makes the point that media, the word itself, comes from a Latin term which means in the middle, to stand between. And the whole point about media is that something is standing between the person and the listener, the one giving the message and the one receiving the message. Now, interestingly, if you were in a large auditorium that held 1,000 people and somebody's speaking at a lectern, you don't really know them, but you're in the same room, there's still media involved because they're using a microphone to communicate across the room. Now imagine, and we don't have to imagine because we all know this, we've done this for the last 2 years, you imagine you're at home, you can't make it to the auditorium, you're on Zoom. There is another, like it's in real time, it's live, it's almost like you're watching it live, it happens, but then there's a disconnection. You're not in the same place. One, you need some media to help you listen to what's being said. Another, you're in a different place. But if you're listening to this, we're not even in the same space. This is recorded earlier. And so every step kind of puts something between you and the person giving the message. And so what happens is the gospel becomes, stay with me, disembodied. It's not an embodied communication. If I meet you and you chat to me and we're speaking one-on-one, even if we've never met before, it's an embodied communication. Here we are, speaking to one another in person. It's clear, I think, both biblically and experientially, that sharing the message of Jesus in an embodied form is the way that the message is best shared, in that personal relationship, in that not just one-on-one, but that where there's this connection, where there's nothing between you, where an authentic relationship helps build a deep, personal, authentic faith. One of the things that Andy Crouch, the point he makes, and I want to quote, I remember a social media post somebody made once, and it was only in the last year. And the social media post was this. It said, could you imagine if Jesus were alive today? Would he not be using media and Facebook and the internet to share his message? Of course he would, said the person writing the tweet. And yet, Jesus only ever chose to use an embodied message in his time. There was one media available to Jesus, and he never used it. It was the media of writing, a bit like Socrates. Apparently, Socrates never wrote anything down. It was Plato that wrote Socrates' words down. Jesus never wrote anything. He could have got scribes. He could have thought, gosh, I better write all this down. It was all afterwards. Jesus chose to come at a time when the only way to share the message was to share an embodied message with another person. And one thing that Andy Crouch makes is he says, it's not to say that media and mass media, in some ways this communication between you and me is kind of like mass media. Many of you won't know me, we wouldn't have met, and all that's happening is that I'm communicating to you through a video. And one of the points that Andy Crouch is making in mass media, he said, what mass media can do where there's no previous relationship and there's no embodied relationship and you don't know this person, he says there's only three things it can do. It can make a message available and accessible, it can make it attractive, and it can make it plausible. That's what media can do, mass media. Make a message available. Without the form of media, you won't ever get the message. It can help make the message attractive by how you frame it up, and it can help make it plausible. And he said one of the things about if there's no relationship, if there's no embodied relationship in communicating it, one of the points that Andy Crouch makes, there's only three ways that it can shift you in mass media. And he says this: you either make them laugh, cry, or wonder, or help them with a problem they already know they have. Now, maybe that's just being a little hard, but here his point is this: make people laugh, make people cry, make people wonder about something, or help them with a problem they already know they have. Now, what Andy Crouch is trying to say is just because you can reach 1 million people with a message through a video, television, social media, webcast format, doesn't mean you have the best way of communicating. He's basically saying, and I think he's right, that it limits what you can do. You can't do everything that you could do in an embodied message. So if that's the case, if that's what we're seeking to do, what is the space of media then? Am I saying that we shouldn't use media? Well, I'm not, because that's what I spend all my time doing. So that would not be a very wise thing to say. But it's one of those things to say, just because you have a large footprint and a large reach doesn't mean you have a deep influence. So what is it we can do with media? If you are in media, you're considering media, you would like to do some media, What are the things that you can do in it? Well, here's the first one. Seek to support, don't replace. Seek to support, don't replace. Your role as someone in media seeking to share the gospel is to stand alongside of and support Christian ministry. It is not to replace it. One of the things that we've sought to do with Olive Tree Media is to create resources that churches can use. And in creating those resources, one of the things we also do is we're trying to produce a whole bunch of other add-ons that help the church use those resources. So in other words, what we're trying to say is, we're not replacing you as a church. We are supporting what you do. And in media ministry, if you can see yourself as not trying to replace the church, but support the church, then you use media at its best. In other words, you are helping people towards that embodied relationship. So firstly, seek to support, don't replace. Secondly, really basic, tell great stories. Well, think about what movies are. What are movies? They're great stories. That's what they are. They capture your imagination. They do all those things that Andy Crouch said. They make you laugh. They make you cry. They make you wonder. They drag you into the story. In fact, our director that we work with actually makes the point that how do you make a bad idea a good idea? Well, in a movie, make a very likable character with very bad values. And interestingly, the values start to look good because you like the character. What is that all about? It's about storytelling. It's about emotion. It's about drawing people in. In your media, think about how do you tell stories? Not how do you just give a 3-point message about something. How do you tell stories, and what stories can you tell? Thirdly, it doesn't mean you can't engage in ideas or intellectual discussion, but you need to find the right platform to do that. And what's happened is the right platform is actually podcasts. Podcasts have become the platform for intellectual ideas. In some ways, podcasts are replacing both the blogger and, in a way, the book. That's where the podcast sits. I want to come back to the podcast in a minute. Fourthly, especially around media, don't be clever, be clear. The thing about media is, and if you've got a good camera, if you've got a good editing package, if you've got graphics, you can produce, Joe Average can produce unbelievably clever stuff. Just fantastic effects and sound effects and visual effects, and cut it all together, and it can be just this engaging visual masterpiece to watch. If you lose the message in the midst of your video media market, brilliant piece of communication, then you've actually failed in your communication. Seek to be clear, not to be clever. Now, yes, be contemporary. Yes, use the tools at your disposal. Yes, be thoughtful and wise, as we've already said, but don't fall for just being clever. Be as clear as you possibly can. Set your approach, style, and length on your medium. Now, let's go back to Acts 17. So what I'm saying is set what you choose to do, how long it will be, the style that you use, how you'll communicate. Set that on the medium that you're about to use. If we go back to Acts 17, Paul is in the Areopagus. He's in the place of learning. He's with basically, bad term, a bunch of pagans who have no kind of connection to Jewish faith or any faith really. And he's trying to communicate in a way that will engage them. And Paul in Acts chapter 17, when he gets the opportunity to engage these people and speak to them, he actually starts with a really odd phrase for Paul. He says, "Men of Athens, I see in every way you're very religious. As I walked around, I looked carefully at your objects of worship, and I found an altar with an inscription to an unknown God. Now what you worship is something unknown. I want to proclaim to you." Now think about that. It's a really interesting approach in the way he connects into his audience, especially when you consider just a couple of chapters before, Luke tells us about Paul in Poseidon, Antioch. And in Poseidon, Antioch, he's speaking to a bunch of Jews and believing Gentiles. Now, here's how he starts. Just keep in mind what I just said before. Idols, unknown God, tell you about something that's unknown. Here's what he says to a bunch of Jewish listeners. Men of Israel and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me. The God of the people of Israel chose our fathers. He made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power, he led them out of the country. He endured their conduct for about 40 years. He overthrew 7 nations, etc., etc., etc. What's Paul doing here? He's given Old Testament history. He's telling them about what they already know, and then he connects that with Jesus. So what we're trying to do is to work out who's the audience, what's the medium, what's the platform, what do I therefore need to do? How do I communicate? So like all media is not the same. It actually varies completely depending on the platform that you're in. I mean, think about this just from a length point of view. If you can produce a great movie, if you have that ability, God bless you. If you can produce a great movie, you've got 90 minutes to 120 minutes. There are movies that are like 120 minutes long, and people will stay engaged because that's the platform. If you do a television show, it has to be pretty good to get past 30 minutes. If you do a YouTube clip, you've got 3 minutes. If you do Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, you've got 30 seconds. So no point taking a movie approach on a Facebook platform, wasting your time. Now, what's really odd is you can imagine all those things are tightening down in time. And yet, going back to the podcast, how long can a podcast be? Any length you like. John Anderson is a friend, I've known him for years. We've interviewed him again on our latest series, and John Anderson he interviewed Jordan Peterson for his new Conversations platform. And he told me about the conversation with Jordan Peterson. If you go on and listen to it, it's 1 hour and 37 minutes. And I was chatting to John about it, and John said, the amazing thing is, Carl, I chatted to Jordan Peterson. I said, thank you, Jordan. It's 1 hour and 37 minutes. I'll cut it back down till it's a bit shorter so people listen. And Jordan Peterson's response was, don't do it. Don't cut it down. There are people out there who will stay and listen for as long as you have it on. Apparently, Jordan Peterson spoke to Rogan recently, and it was like a 3-hour podcast. Now, podcasts are unique. You can watch a podcast. Most people listen to them. They listen while they drive. They listen while they're doing something different, walking or doing something else. So you don't have to sit still and watch. Podcasts give you almost any length of time you like, as long as you've got interesting people with good ideas who know what they're talking about. All those things are important. But what we're saying here is media is not just one thing. It's many different platforms. And what you need to do is ask, what's your audience? What's your platform? How much time have I got? How do I create that? In the middle of all this, I just want to add this one statement out of a book I read years and years ago about ministry in the local church. And this Leith Anderson made this comment. We now live in a time where excellence is only noticed by its absence. Let that sink in. Excellence is only noticed by its absence. If you turn up to something and everything works smoothly, you don't go, wow, how amazing. It's all, you don't go to see a movie and go, wow, they started on time, and there's movies the shots are in focus, and I can hear the music clearly. You don't notice that because you are used to imbibing excellence. In Christian media, we need to be in that same space. You can't come up with a whole bunch of half-baked material and expect people to watch it. Our society, for better, for worse, that's the way they function. Excellence has to be the air that we breathe. So what are we saying? Media is incredibly important in gospel ministry, but it won't replace embodied ministry. The fact that it's mediating between the speaker and the person means that there are things that are missed in that process. So it's best that, because it doesn't replace that embodied discipling gospel relationship, it's a supportive role. Tell stories, make people laugh, cry, wonder. Tell stories, do it well, and build your content with the audience and the medium you are using in mind. Seriously, media ministry these days, the sky is the limit. Social media means that everybody can be a publisher, everybody can be a speaker, communicator, producer. But the problem is, in that marketplace, it is so busy and so noisy, it's almost harder to be heard. My prayer is that whatever God calls you to in media ministry, Be sure you're committed to the message of Jesus. Be extravagant in how you spread it. Be wise in what you do. And I pray God blesses every moment and every action as you seek to serve Him with the gospel in media ministry.